might be a good idea to engage in a little bit of definition of terms. Can you hear me okay? Yes. Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, because so the definition of term occultus is a Latin word which means hidden or concealed. And so for ages the research into and the being occupied with the secret side of life has been named occultism. So hidden or concealed. So it is important to remember as an entryway to this subject, which we of course explore here from various angles, that there are, you might say, it's based on the supposition that there are data available to the human mind that are generally or commonly not accessible to humankind, and therefore it is referred to as that hidden stuff, that occult stuff, a realm of cognition, not generally accessible to humankind and to the human mind, that never, that is really a confession of practically a lifetime of failure, that in my old age I cannot read my own handwriting. So you have to have compassion for that. So it seems that such human exploration has always existed, but was usually kept secret, and hence the term occultism. So occultism thus existed in every historical period, from ancient and remote shamanism to this present moment, in what may be called the modern era. Maybe beginning with the Reformation, so where the modern age really supposed to start is kind of anybody's guess. So in the various historical books you will find it, some will count it from by occultism is existed in every historical period, but from ancient remote times down throughout history, and so depending on where you begin the counting from, it may be called the modern era. Sometimes it is counted to start with the Reformation, maybe with World War I, which is certainly a much later period. There were always those who knew as against those who didn't know, which also reminds me of my favorite quotations from Krishnamurti, who already as a young boy one of his earliest literary creations, At the Feet of the Master, I think, wrote that in all the world there are only two kinds of people, those who know and those who don't know. And you can sort of interpret this as you wish. But let's say, what may be called the modern era, which, as I say, can start here, can start there, we don't know. One useful concept in this regard is the one that really came into public use pretty much with the rise of depth psychology, and that is consciousness, or what in German is called Bewusstsein. Bewusst is to be conscious, to be conscious, so consciousness. The occult becomes less occult when consciousness is attached to address what may be called occult reality. We spoke already last time, because of the immense importance in terms of consciousness, at least in the Western world, of this particular factor, that the awareness of consciousness and its opposite, unconsciousness, is really a product of the early 20th century, because it was in the year 1000 or the year before that Sigmund Freud published his first and his really epochal work, which put modern psychology on the stage, and when he published his book on dreams. So it's curious that the study of consciousness is something that arose out of the understanding of the unconscious, as Freud called it, namely the dream. And you know, his deciphering of the psychological meaning of dreams, Freud considered really his own greatest deed and greatest work. His dream was always that at the house of, 19, I think, Berggasse in Vienna, there would be a plaque saying, in this house in 1899, Dr. Sigmund Freud discovered the meaning of dreams. That's what he was most proud of. And certainly within his way of evaluating the human mind, it is understandable, because here he discovered, so he felt, and I think to a major extent he was right, here he discovered the way in which the unconscious, das Unbewusste, or sometimes in English referred to as the unconscious mind, was manifest in a manner that, with some insight and some knowledge and certainly a lot of experience, could be interpreted in terms of the movings of the other mind that came to be called then the unconscious mind, das Unbewusste, and by way of this discovery, let us say the existence and much of the dynamics of the unconscious psyche, as we call it now, was discovered. So that definitely was a very important thing. I also mentioned, I think last time, that involved to a certain extent in that discovery was something that most psychoanalysts, which are the Freudian analysts nowadays, would try to deny, and that is that the discovery would never have happened had it not been for hypnosis. Freud had a partner, Dr. Breuer, in Vienna, who knew very well how to hypnotize. And so the two of them worked together, and Dr. Breuer would hypnotize the patients and then put them into an altered state of consciousness, as we would call it nowadays, and by listening to and interpreting what thus came forth, the insight into the unconscious dynamics of the mind of the patient was discovered. Now, at the same time, when this was going on in the Berggasse in Vienna, which means Mountain Street, in the Berggasse in Vienna, there was also somebody else who was working along these lines and who was greatly excited and inspired by what Freud had done, but who then began to add to that body of knowledge and to these activities from the insights that he himself gained. And that was, of course, Dr. Carl Jung in Zurich in Switzerland. And I mentioned the famous scene, which I'm not going to repeat again, just because it is a famous scene. If it were not famous, then I should repeat it. But since it is famous already, I don't think I should repeat it, which had to do with the first visit, personal visit, that Carl Gustav Jung paid to Sigmund Freud in Vienna, and the subject of their conversation. Not to repeat too much of that particular incident, let's just say that what Jung was trying to bring powerfully to Freud's attention was a field of endeavor which came up periodically in the practice of the depth psychologists and psychoanalysts, and which was related to what later on came to be called psychical research or occultism, and maybe even by a few other names. In other words, by discovering the keyhole of the unconscious mind and opening up the unconscious mind, Freud stepped into a territory which has been locomoted in and which has existed for a very long time, but for the last 100 years prior to his time had attained to a certain amount of fame. And as it so often happens, the the searchlight was turned on this obscure corner of the human psyche by way of by way of the altered states of consciousness which people manage to induce in themselves or in each other by various means. In the state of New York and in some other of the eastern states, usually rather young people, teenagers and so forth, who then as now were or are bored, because it goes with the territory, had detected some kind of an unusual influence in their house in Hydesville, New York, which is a small locality. And they came to the conclusion that these noises and the curious impressions that they received were not from living people, but that rather they must originate with discarnate souls or spirits. And in the farmhouse in Hydesville, New York, there came forth a new field which subsequently really swept the world, but like so many big exciting ideas that sweep the world for a while, really pretty much went its own way in a few decades, and that was spiritualism. And so spiritualism was based on the belief, rightfully or wrongfully, that people, when entering some altered state of consciousness by way of hypnosis or in other ways, would be able to communicate with unseen entities, would hear unusual voices, still always in being in this country in English, and ultimately they concluded, with the aid often of very learned people from the universities, that there was indeed a likelihood, although certainly not a certainty, that these voices came from beyond the curtain of life, and that they were communications or attempted communications from dead people. Now you got to keep in mind that when all of this was sort of developing and brewing on the horizon, there's something else was going on. And that was the great and catastrophic American Civil War, in which the number of the casualties was greater than in any other war that the United States fought before that, during that, or after that time. So immense. Now when there are an immense number of dead, then there are an immense number of people left behind by the dead. And those, for the most part, have an interest, if at all possible, to contact those dead and perhaps have conversations with them. And so that was the beginning of spiritualism. But it was also discovered by Freud and Jung and others that something unusual was involved in the minds of the people who apparently were manifesting in this fashion, and also of those people who were the agents of the manifestation, in this case the two young girls, Kathy and Maggie Fox, from Hydesville, New York. So this was the beginning of spiritualism, because of the great desire of such a very large number of people to contact their dead, the ones who died in the Civil War. And so as the result of that, there was a great deal of activity which, at least ostensibly, and never in a proven fashion, but ostensibly consisted of communications of people who were no longer in their bodies and who found ways of conducting such communications with others. Now, the reason that I am going into this is not really for any other reason, but to come back to that term occult. Because certainly communicating with the dead, receiving messages from the dead is an unusual circumstance and one that when it appears to be happening creates a certain amount of excitement. And so it was at this particular time. So and before you knew it, because let's face it, this is to talk to the dead is an exciting possibility. Now, whether you like that sort of thing or not, I don't know, but it is an exciting possibility. And if any of you, and I'm sure that there are a number of you here, any of you who have at some point in your life have experienced the demise of somebody who was close to you, will testify to it, that the desire to be connected with someone who is no longer in the body, but with whom the conscious mind of an individual wishes to be connected, that this is a very, very strong psychological desire that many, many people have, particularly if there has been a death in their immediate circle of friends or family. To miss somebody who has traveled to Timbuktu and who by God's grace and the airlines is expected back is on an entirely different level than the desire to communicate with the dead, because we miss them. And moreover, we miss them in a situation where the likelihood of the cessation of that condition is not likely. We know that we are going to continue to miss these people. And, all of us have had, most of us have had experiences of that sort. So now, nevertheless, even though this activity was designed to function in a setting of people trying to talk to the dead, or as the Victorian expression called them, the dear departed. So there, it was of great interest. It was of great importance, even among people who have not had anybody of their family or close friendship had gone to the other side of the big curtain, but simply because the entire field is of an unusual and fascinating, peculiar nature. There is no people on the face of the earth no matter what culture they may come forth from, that does not have some belief in, the afterlife, where a certain psychological need to still be close to those who have gone is very great. And for this reason, this was a very alive situation. It incidentally, in the English-speaking countries, it was called spiritualism. In France, it was called spiritism, because of talking to les esprits, the spirits, And but in all of these instances, there was a great deal of interest aroused. Incidentally, nowadays the term spiritism and spiritualism still exist. What we would call spiritualist people in what would be called the spiritualist people in this country would be called spiritists, were mostly in Brazil, because the French spiritist movement led by the prophet, the great and powerful writer Allan Kardec, whose nom de plume, his name, which was not his nom de plume, was Denisard Louis Rivail, just to flaunt my remembrance of past times. In any event, it's the French spiritism that came to be transplanted to South America to a great extent. But the American, needless to say, the similarity of language and so forth, went to England, and from there to the various countries of the continent. So it was a spiritualist movement that stirred up a lot of people with their interest in what later on often came to be called the borderline sciences. That always sort of amuses me, is this borderline, and then scientists, walking around, and then there comes the border police and throws them out. You go back to the grave, which is sort of what is going on now. In any event, so this was a very powerful, how should we put it, a very powerful knock on the door of Western culture. Because you also must remember that the 19th century and into parts of the 20th century was also the time of a great obsession with science. It was none other than Carl Jung who said that the 19th century was the Dark Ages, primarily because of the dogmatic obsession of people with what they considered at the time, and much of it would not be considered nowadays, as scientific fact. and so the 19th century worship of science, which began back in the 18th century with various scientific minds, therefore also played a great role in all of this, because in order for some subject, and this is a general statement, now see how it sits with you, that when there is a subject that has both powerful advocates and equally powerful critics, and then you have the conflict of these two, that creates a very lively society, as the political conflicts at the present time in our fair country have proven. So that is what was going on. There were the scientifically minded, the rationalists, the Darwinists, and all of them. Oh, you know, it's all evolution. That's why I'm always somewhat suspicious and unhappy when my theosophical friends keep using the term evolution, because what we are really dealing with here is something very different. But that was the buzzword of the age. That was Darwin, and people even made their jokes conform to it. So like the one that I love so much, that in their New York apartment when Madame Blavatsky and Colonel Olcott were both living for a period of time, in the foyer as you came in, on a shelf, there was a stuffed gorilla. And the stuffed gorilla wore evening clothes, full evening clothes, and had a top hat, and underneath was the metal identification badge, Charles Darwin. So, you know, the monkey business was pretty big. And understandably controversial. No, but interesting to say that at the same time, monkey business or none, there was a very important upsurge of the occult, which began already in the latter part of the 19th century, and one of the results of which was the foundation in November of 1875 in New York City of the Theosophical Society by its two leading lights, Helena Petrovna Blavatsky and Henry Steele Olcott. So let's say it was a period of immense creativity, and that creativity in part manifested in the interest of realities that ordinarily were considered to be invisible, and possible theories concerning their activities, their comings and goings, and so forth. So there we were, and occultism, to come back to that word, thus existed, as we mentioned, in every historical period, and the useful concept in this regard, which I recall now again, is consciousness. In German it is Bewusstsein. Now, bewusst means cognizant, and Bewusstsein means cognizant of oneself. So this is of importance for our purposes. So the occult in that period, and interestingly enough, quite in the same circles as this scientism, as it was often called, is the recognition that with our consciousness we can become conscious of more than we ordinarily do. So that if we want to have the knowledge of various factors that we ordinarily don't have, including, let's say, the knowledge of the communication with the dead in spiritualism, that these curious events are possible, and that they depend on the workings of of human consciousness. So what all of these events of that period really proved was that what the Germans call Bewusstsein, namely consciousness, became extremely important, and as a consequence of that circumstance, the occult became less occult when consciousness is altered to address what may be seen as occult reality, or called occult reality. Now, Sigmund Freud, the Viennese physician, discovered that in certain altered states of consciousness, in his case initially primarily by way of hypnosis, access may be gained for the conscious mind, as he would call it, to what psychoanalysis began to call the unconscious, das Unbewusste in German, that which is not conscious. Yeah. So it never rains but it pours, and so spiritualism, occult phenomena, the range of what Freud called the unconscious was being disputed. Freud restricted it to the repressed instinctual material in the mind. In other words, that theory is simple. We all have ideas, fantasies, desires that are socially or familiarly not very highly regarded. And inasmuch as they are disapproved of by people whom we approve of, we then try to repress them. And this is, of course, the great insight of modern depth psychology, that many ideas and desires that we nourish drop out of consciousness because they make us uncomfortable. And you know, of course, that Freudian psychology was very much involved with the sexual instinct, primarily because that was probably the main thing that most people who came to visit Dr. Freud's and Dr. Breuer's office were thinking about, but who at the same time were ashamed of their fantasies and their desires in that realm, and therefore set up certain contradictory feelings in a lot of people. And so that being the case, we can continue with our occult. The occult becomes less occult when consciousness is altered to address what may be called occult reality, because that is what the two doctors were doing on the couch there. They tried to add conscious, rational reality to the insights, the images that came forth in the dreams and other fantasies of patients. And this in itself caused important development. So what may be called occult reality, because of the ability of people to call it forth, now was brought into activity. So then, just 1 minute. Meanwhile, on both continents, European and American, the people began to be interested in what may be called occultism, and this interest took shape, and again often had to do with the relationship of the living and the dead. Because in Europe, of course, also, even though the dead were not as, casualties were not as immense as in the American Civil War, there were a lot of people in the 19th century and eventually, of course, in the 20th century, who were slaughtered in the wars. So there were the Napoleonic Wars in Europe, and as I mentioned before, the Civil War in America. And all of this caused an upsurge of spiritualism and spiritism. The people who were at least putting themselves forth as the voices of the other world were often and repeatedly called mediums, because they were mediators in people's minds between the two worlds. So important such mediums came forward, and largely because of their activities, the interest in the occult continued. So famous American mediums were the Fox sisters, and then, of course, interest in the paranormal, as it came to be called, grew all over the world. Very few people, I think, because of various geographical and historical circumstances, are aware that the interest in the occult in Russia was extremely strong. This was in part, just for the historical accuracy, this was in part the result of the close connection of the court of the Tsar and various circles of high Russian aristocracy with France and with the French occult revival, which occurred at that time. And here, let us say, the spiritualist element began to subside. It wasn't mainly to contact the dead that the majority of the French occultists carried on their business, but it was rather that with a number of outstanding individuals, one of them having been the gentleman who assumed the Hebrew name of Eliphas Levi Zahed, and others, there arose an interest in a much more subtle, much more philosophical, and ultimately more transcendental kind of occultism. And that this was of very great importance. It is not known to too many today that Madame Blavatsky had some of her most faithful supporters in France. And if it was really in France, when having returned somewhat unsuccessfully from India to England in the right around the turn of the century, she has contacted certain occult circles, part of them through her friend, an English lady, the Countess of Caithness, who was also Duchesse de Pommard, the wife of a French duke. And it was there, I'm just throwing that in because this is something that comes up again and again, that it was there that Madame Blavatsky felt, how should I put it? Madame Blavatsky felt that her willingness and desire to take further steps in her occultism than she had up to that time done became most evident, because in the chapel in Paris of the Duchesse de Pommard, Madame Blavatsky wrote her magnificent mystical poem, which I'm not going to read to you now. I did it at some other times, The Voice of the Silence and various others. So what I'm trying to hint at here, which at other time I have not been hinting, is that today's or yesterday's theosophy is not the theosophy of old Blavatsky. What I mean is that she was not, and she has said so, and we have now an increasing body of evidence indicating that she said so and wrote so. She was not interested in bringing another belief system into the world. she felt that there were too many of those around already. But she was after something else, which even today very few people are cognizant of. And what was that? That there is a possibility, even a likelihood, that individual human people, no matter what their background, no matter what their race, what their religion, what other factors may be, are capable of arousing within themselves a mysterious power, which Blavatsky referred to as the human essence. And that when they are able to come to this, they are about to enter what might be called the superhuman realm, and that this is possible. And that when we contemplate that, then we can also see with considerable clarity, I think, that the purpose, the secret purpose, and secret is occult, the occult purpose of Blavatsky's work was primarily the rediscovery of a certain occult potential in the human being, a potential of enlightenment, a potential of growing into a superhuman status, and that she had to write 2 huge volumes of Isis Unveiled, and I don't know, I have a set of the Secret Doctrine that I think is about 10 volumes, but there is also one with only 3 volumes. In any event, all of her writings in which she created a framework within which the true purpose of her career could materialize and could produce a very important result. So what are we dealing with here? Okay, what's the Secret Doctrine all about? Well, it says you're not going to tell me because it's thousands of pages, and I know that I spent nights and nights and nights studying it when I was young. I couldn't figure out what it was then. But let's say the framework that was created primarily with the Secret Doctrine was a cosmological, or as Max Heindel would have called it, a cosmoconceptual framework within which individual transcendental or mystical experience found its place and was encouraged in its practice. Because with her very heretical ideas as far as conventional Christianity was concerned and others, she proclaims that everything that is here and elsewhere in the cosmos and in the on our earth is an emanation, which is the technical term for it, an emanation, an outpouring, which is what emanation means, emaneo, I go forth, of a transcendental deific figure. So she did away with the conventional monotheistic framework of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, the 3-leaved clover, as I like to call them, but a discovery that everything is God. How do you like that? And of course that is very hard for people to deal with, because for so many thousands of years they came to envision in their Bewusstsein, in their consciousness, a singular unitary deity to whom is ascribed the creation and the management of the world wherein we live. So what you have here is a turning of the functional pyramid of being around, in the sense that there is, what would be the best way of putting it? There has been a material creation, or development, or whatever you want to call it, for the very purpose of developing within that creation beings such as ourselves, who are able to facilitate the development of the indwelling divine seed in the human. The human, therefore, in Blavatsky's cosmology, is an unfinished creature. We are unfinished, not in terms of having to grow another pair of legs or 2 or 3 more heads, which would be kind of interesting. I would like to see people with with several heads listening to these radios nowadays, and so, but rather that we have the potential of a spiritual development. If we work at it, we can facilitate the development of the totality of our nature in such a way that hidden glory, that seed of the Godhead, which we have brought with us from unknown places, can break forth from within us and develop the totality of our nature in a transcendental inner way. So, in other words, Blavatsky came here, and what the heck, they didn't have so many words for these things as perhaps we have today, and so they would say, well, the human is to develop into the superhuman. Even Nietzsche cultivated the man and the superman, So the potential is there. But some stimuli have to be extended to the human in order to develop that. And when these stimuli are extended, then the human can become more than a human is today. The human can become superhuman, man and superman of Nietzsche again. But here the very idea is that there is a transcendental spiritual seed within the human. And that this seed, like seeds of plants, can grow. And it can grow into magnificent structures of the spirit. But the human has to be aware of that possibility and avail himself or herself of opportunities that would be conducive to that development. And this development, this deification of the human, this expansion of the human nature into a transcendental dimension, unfortunately, for lack of available expressions, Madame Blavatsky and her followers called evolution. It is not evolution, it is transformation. It is the ability to bring forth from that plant seed a great and a glorious and a divine plant, which bloomed in the heavens before it came here, and where it intends to return. These are, of course, poetic expressions. But so that's the question. But instead of that, various people, including my theosophical brothers and sisters, whom I joined a long time ago, longer than my 93-year-old memory will stretch. They indicated that there is a developmental possibility. There is a plan, and the term plan has been used. And that plan is the redeification of the human. The human was divine to begin with when he came here. But now it could re-become that potential once again. And that we need to be aware of that. And this was really the purpose, the occult purpose, the secret purpose. Because why was it secret? Well, you better ask Madame Blavatsky. If I were a medium, I could ask her, hey, Helena Petrovna, tell us. And you can never tell, because she would take up challenges very easily. It's really, if you read some of the less well-known data about her life, you really come up with some interesting things. She would go home to visit the relatives, and after all, she had many of them in Russia, and came to one of the country houses. I'm quite familiar with that, and her children there. And she said, oh my God, I didn't bring anything for the children. And I know how that was. If you went to visit a family with children, you better bring some toys and things for the children. That's the way it was in our society too. So she said, all right, I will be with you in a few minutes. Do you have a room that's empty where there's nobody? No, it has furniture. But, all right, I want to lock myself in there for about 2 hours. So in she went, and then when she emerged, she was carrying and leading a plethora of toys that weren't there before. So let us say she had, because of her own inner development, and as time goes on, we learn more and more of what she did in order of this development, even early in her life. In terms of her inner development, she acquired or developed occult powers, which gave her, to some extent and degree, a command over the forces of nature. So she could materialize things, and in other ways do the same. So people, of course, were astonished, and they revered her greatly, mainly when she was able to do things like that. But let's see how all of this connected up, how this had to do with the future of humanity, the deification of humanity. This never became very clear. Now, if you ask me, and you haven't, and you probably shouldn't, as to why, what's the secret? Well, the secret is because this the overwhelming majority of the countries in this world, Christian, Muslim, Jewish, so primarily the monotheistic countries, the monotheistic peoples, would consider the obtaining of such occult faculties on the part of H.P. Blavatsky a sacrilegious act, and probably try to, after the fashion of the inquisitors, try to publicize her as a disciple of the devil. And so you had to be careful about those things. Even when I was a child, when I brought up some of these Gnostic things that I was studying already, I had to be real careful, because most people would say, oh, that is a terrible heresy, and where did you learn that? And send me off to a monastery, which happened anyway, but for different reasons. So let us say there was an utterly, completely, and entirely radical thesis that verily, as indeed, according to the New Testament, Jesus Christ is supposed to have said, verily ye are gods. Which in this case means we all have come from a transcendental great divine source, and to recover that status and to bring forth into operation those faculties and those powers is probably the most important task that we have. And when you come to statements like her statements about the Theosophical Society, and there is no religion higher than truth, and so forth. Here the truth is the fact that you are divine, and that it is the only job that you really have is to make that divinity manifest as it is supposed to. When you have done that, you have completed the course of humanity. When you haven't, then you should go about doing it if you can. So now here we have, let's say, this is the crown of occultism. This is like the halo of the saints above their heads, that there are people, there always have been, and there will be, and the more we work at it, the more it will be people who have developed within themselves the potential of transcendence. Now, I know that I have spoken for a long time, but let me just throw in a hint or not. C.G. Jung had early in his career discovered that there are certain, how should we put it, certain types, certain tendencies in humans. And that, for instance, one of these is the tendency of introversion or extroversion. What that means is that there are those who look for the satisfactions of their lives outside of themselves. Oh yeah, I sure would like that that Wiener Schnitzel in Vienna from right now, you know, out there and physical. And this is the extroverted tendency of the mind. We conceive of various situations and objects and activities outside of ourselves, which if we attain to them, well, then maybe we would get that bluebird of happiness of Maurice Maeterlinck, you know. Very, very natural tendency. But then there is the other side. This is one of the great dualities. And that is that as for one reason or the other, we are able to look inside of ourselves, do like an ostrich who puts his head under his wings and says, "Oh, look, I'm an ostrich." Actually, I never heard them say that, but it makes sense. So, you know, so what we have is we have the ability not just to look out there for interesting things, but see, wow, you know, there is something interesting in here. I don't want to get personal, but let's put it that way. I had experiences of that sort, and certainly not, equals of a Saint Teresa of Avila or something like that, who is my beloved saint, but rather that if we begin to look close at hand instead of far away, we may discover something far more exciting than what we thought we would discover or maybe have discovered outside. And that is why one of Jung's very first psychological statements was the extrovert and introvert. And that these in turn create the two main types. And then, of course, there are the functional types of sensate, emotional, intellectual, and mental, and eventually transcendental functions of consciousness. That we have these potential functions within us. And once again, that if we cultivate them, if we work on them, then they will grow, expand like a beautiful plant, and will show us a foretaste, at least, of the immense potentiality that is within us. And so, when you look around our culture and various things come up, and think and grow rich, and all these new age fantasies and so forth. What is done there? It hints at the possibility that we can do all kinds of things if we just put our minds to them. But we should also be careful, because as Madame Blavatsky never ceased practically to point out, that if these powers of our spiritual growth, of our spiritual expansion, then develop into a self-promoting, selfish, some kind of a selfishness, then we have turned the situation completely around. So that, and that is why she always emphasized that the most important thing to keep in mind all the time is kindliness, love, and compassion toward our fellow beings. So in that respect, she was very much a Buddhist, and I think that was, she indicated that if that love of your fellow humans is not there, then the chances are very, very great that you are going to go wrong. That the villains of history are those who had no compassion, who had no love, the Stalins and the Hitlers and the Mao Zedongs and the Pol Pots and people like that. You see, yeah, they have developed certain powers. They know how to obtain and hold on to power and to put everybody out of the way who might stand in the way. You know. But that is not what it is all about. What it is about is not the amassing of external power, but the bringing forth a power that, like King Arthur in his coffin on the isle, sleeps, you know, is present with us, but can be awakened, has been awakened, will be awakened. And that is what all the yogas are all about. That is what the great Christian saints are all about. Look, there are books, very, very reputable academic works coming out right now from British universities and so. And I cannot think of the particular one, but a wonderful book about, it's called Those Who Flew. If you encounter it somewhere, look at it, because it is about primarily the saints. This is written by a gentleman who was born and raised in Cuba and is now teaching university in England. Miraculous deeds, which in all the various religions only the gods and the angels were known to perform, have been performed by humans. When they got hold of that angelic, that transcendental, that messianic, that deific seed within them. Once you are in touch with it properly and you approached it properly, I would venture the suggestion and the promise, it will never leave you. It may go into a quieter period, but it will always be there. This is what St. Paul writes about in his letter, the Christ in you, the hope of glory. There is something marvelous there, something altogether tremendous, something that if it is indeed within the greater will, we always have to recognize that, because our will, even though it may be benign and good, our will is not the same as certain greater will powers that manifest to us and above us. But when these begin to manifest, then the ineffable greatness, the Buddha nature, the interior Krishna begins to move. And when he moves, he grows. And when he grows and grows and grows. And eventually you can say that you have facilitated the incarnation of the deity in you. And that this is what you are supposed to do, not anything else. If you recognize that potential, which is the higher self in the theosophical nomenclature and so forth, if you recognize that, and if you do whatever you can along the way to facilitate that development, then how does is it? Madame Blavatsky was one to quote a German mystic, one of the Rhineland mystics, in saying that he who has the strength to roll back the stone of matter from his own inner sanctuary, he has the risen Christ in him. This is the one that I like to quote at Easter time, which is coming up. But you see, it is there, but it has to be discovered. If you have, I don't know, if you have to, if Dr. Carl Jung, who is one of the people I probably most respect, Dr. Carl Jung lives in the same house with you. Unless you recognize who he is and recognize his deeds and his power, then you have not recognized very much. So your recognition of the ineffable greatness which is around you and about you and inside of you, that is what will redeem us, that is what will save us, that is what will elevate us to the highest heavens of consciousness and of divinity. Because it was always such, and one of the people who was apparently commissioned to restate this again, in spite of the difficulties of so doing, was the short, corpulent, cigarette smoking and having her morning eggs swimming in butter, old woman named Helena Petrovna Blavatsky. She didn't come, she was sent. And she in turn sends us. Be aware of that. Look, this is what is really important. What is important is that you can tear open the bars of the prison inside of you and let out the hidden glory, which does not have to remain hidden, but you can make it manifest. That's what it was. Now I know the way I'm phrasing it and so forth, a lot of my theosophical and occult friends would say, well, I dreamt it up. No, I didn't dream it up. That is why this movement was of such immense cultural importance, as our good Mitch Horowitz writes about it, because Blavatsky came onto the recognition and the need for the cultivation of the immensity of that deific potential that is within the human being. And when that is recognized, when that is worked, then the world is being saved. The world is being redeemed. Humanity is redeemed. All the silly political ideas of how to elevate humanity in this and that and the other thing are nothing compared to that. Because this lifts you into eternity. This lifts you into that which transcends everything that we have seen before. This is indeed the redemption, the salvation, the liberation of the human soul, and so mote it be. And we shall continue along similar lines later. But I am not just whistling Dixie, all my adult life and some before it, as a teenager, I was trying to find out what the message was. What did Blavatsky try to do? What, for that matter, what did Jesus Christ want to do? They all wanted to do the same. They wanted us to remember and then come home. And these are the ways in which that can be done, and that is something amazing and astonishing and wonderful. So thank you very much again, dear folk. Some of these subjects are more difficult to bring forth than others, but I have to do it. Okay.